Your son is going to be famous.
There is a specific kind of pain that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive at your door with sirens or warnings. It does not come wrapped in the face of a stranger. It comes quietly. It comes from someone who knows your mother's name, someone who was there the night you cried in the parking lot of a hospital, someone who held your secrets for 2 decades as carefully as if they were holding glass. It comes from the person you would have taken a bullet for, and it hits harder than any bullet ever could, because you never saw it coming, and by the time you understood what had happened, everything you had built, everything you had trusted, everything you had given without asking for anything in return, was already gone. This is the story of Marcus and Daniel, 2 men who grew up with nothing, who built a friendship so solid that people around them used it as a standard, who talked about those two the way people talk about a rare thing they are lucky to have witnessed. And this is the story of what happened when one of them got rich. Not comfortable, not successful. Rich. The kind of rich that changes the air in a room when you walk in. The kind of rich that puts distance between people who used to share everything. And what happened after that, what unfolded in the years that followed, is the kind of story that stays with you long after the screen goes dark, because it does not just tell you something about Marcus and Daniel. It tells you something about all of us, about what we are capable of, about what we are willing to do to the people we love most, when enough money is sitting on the table. Before we go any further into this story, take a second right now and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, from every city, every state, every corner of this country. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the stories we bring you on this channel are the kind you will not stop thinking about for days. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Because to understand how a friendship of 20 years could end in a federal courtroom, you have to understand what that friendship was built on, and you have to understand the 2 boys who built it, before the world got its hands on them and started pulling them in opposite directions. Marcus Allen grew up in a 2-bedroom house on Garfield Street in Columbus, Ohio, with his mother, his younger sister, and a father who worked double shifts at a warehouse 6 days a week and still never quite made ends meet. The house was small. The winters were hard. There were weeks when the heat did not work right, and weeks when the refrigerator was more empty than full. But there was something in that house, a kind of dignity that his mother carried in her posture, in the way she pressed Marcus's school shirts the night before every single school day regardless of how tired she was, that made Marcus understand from a very young age that who you are has nothing to do with how much you have. His mother told him that so many times it became the quiet foundation of everything he believed about the world. You build your character first. Everything else follows. Marcus was the kind of child teachers remembered years after he left their classroom. Not because he was loud or demanding, but because of the quality of his attention. He listened to everything. He observed everything. And when he put pencil to paper, whether it was a drawing, a diagram, or a written assignment, there was a precision and a thoughtfulness to it that made people stop and look twice. He had a gift. And even at 11 years old, the people around him knew it. He just did not know yet what to do with it or where it would take him. He was a quiet boy, navigating a loud world, and he moved through it carefully, watching, waiting, learning the shape of things before he committed to any direction. Daniel Brooks lived 4 houses down on the same street. If Marcus was the one who observed the world, Daniel was the one who performed for it. He was the loudest voice on any block. The one who organized the neighborhood football games, the one who talked his way into situations he had no business being in, and talked his way back out just as smoothly. His mother was a nurse who worked nights. His father had left when Daniel was 7, and though Daniel never talked about it directly, the people who knew him well could see it. The hunger for approval, the relentless need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be the most important person in whatever room he was standing in. He was funny and he was charming and he was exhausting in the best possible way, and from the first afternoon he walked over to Marcus's yard and started talking without being invited. Marcus was completely drawn in. They were 12 years old when they became inseparable. 2 boys from the same block with nothing in common on the surface and everything in common underneath. Both raised by strong women, both watching their families strain under financial pressure, both quietly determined that their lives were going to look different from what they had grown up seeing. They had a private handshake they developed that summer, a long, elaborate sequence of movements they practiced until they could do it without looking. And for the next 23 years, no matter how much time had passed or how far life had pulled them apart, that handshake was still there. The shorthand of a friendship built before either of them was old enough to understand what a real friendship cost. Through middle school and into high school, Marcus and Daniel were fixtures in each other's lives. They played on the same basketball team for 2 years until Marcus quit because he preferred drawing in the art room after school, a decision Daniel teased him about endlessly but privately respected. They studied together in the school library on Thursday nights, when Daniel needed help with English essays and Marcus needed someone to quiz him on history dates. They went to prom in a group of 6, wearing matching colored ties that Daniel had coordinated with more enthusiasm than any of them expected, and they stood together in the parking lot at 2 in the morning after the after-party, talking about what they wanted their lives to look like in 10 years, in 20, when they were grown men with their own houses and their own stories. Marcus said he wanted to design things, buildings maybe, or brands, something that would exist in the world as a physical testament to the fact that he had been here, that he had made something beautiful out of nothing. Daniel said he wanted to be rich. He did not dress it up. He did not wrap it in a more acceptable ambition. He said he wanted to never worry about money the way his mother worried about money, and he was going to do whatever it took to get there. Marcus laughed. Daniel was serious. That was the difference between them, and somehow, it was also the glue. When they graduated high school, Marcus received a partial scholarship to a design school in Cincinnati. He packed everything he owned into 2 bags and drove away from Garfield Street, with his mother crying in the driveway and Daniel standing next to her, arm around her shoulders, telling her that her son was going to be famous. Daniel stayed in Columbus for 2 years, worked at a car dealership, saved money, and eventually enrolled in a business program at a local university, which he completed in 3 years while working full-time. The distance between them, 2 hours on the highway, never quite felt real. They called each other constantly. They drove to see each other on long weekends. When Marcus got his first design internship and called Daniel at midnight to tell him, Daniel shouted so loudly into the phone that Marcus had to hold it away from his ear. When Daniel's first serious girlfriend left him, and he sat in his apartment for 4 days barely eating, Marcus drove to Columbus on a Saturday morning, knocked on the door, and stayed the entire weekend without being asked. That was the texture of what they had. That was what 20 years looked like when it was real. After graduating, Marcus built his career steadily and quietly, the way he did everything. He freelanced for several years, taking clients where he could find them, small businesses, local nonprofits, a few regional restaurant chains, building a portfolio that was modest in size but exceptional in quality. He had an eye that clients could not always articulate, but could always feel. When Marcus designed something, it did not just look right, it felt right. It had a kind of emotional coherence that made people trust what they were looking at before they even understood why. He was not wealthy, was not even particularly comfortable for most of his 20s, but he was building something real, and he knew it, and that knowledge sustained him through the lean years in a way that nothing external could have. Daniel moved faster and louder, as he always had. After finishing his business degree, he launched his first company at 26, a small retail consulting firm that burned through its initial funding inside 18 months and closed quietly, without much fanfare. He did not talk about it much. He absorbed it and moved on, which was one of Daniel's genuine strengths, his refusal to be stopped by failure, his ability to treat every closed door as simply the wrong door and keep walking until he found the right one. His second venture was a mobile food business that ran for 3 years, turned a small profit, and then stalled when he could not secure the funding needed to scale it. He sold what assets he could and walked away with just enough to start thinking about what came next. Through both of these failures, Marcus was there, listening to the plans, giving honest feedback when asked for it, celebrating the small wins, sitting with Daniel through the frustrations. That was what they did for each other. That was the contract, unwritten and absolute, that had governed their friendship since they were 12 years old on Garfield Street. By the time they were both in their mid-30s, Marcus had built a small but respected freelance design practice, and Daniel was deep into the development of his third company, a logistics technology startup that aimed to streamline last-mile delivery for regional businesses. The kind of operational problem that was unglamorous to talk about, but extremely valuable to solve. Daniel had spent 2 years developing the concept, building relationships with potential clients, and putting together a business plan detailed enough to take seriously. He was sharper than he had been in his earlier ventures, more patient, more focused. The failures had not broken him, they had educated him. And this time, something was different in the way he talked about it. A quieter confidence that Marcus noticed and mentioned to him on a phone call one night. "You sound like you actually believe this one," Marcus said. Daniel laughed. "I do," he said. "I really do." In the spring of the year, Daniel turned 37. A private investment firm based in Chicago that specialized in logistics and supply chain technology agreed to a meeting. Daniel flew out on a Tuesday with a presentation he had revised 47 times. He sat across the table from 2 partners who asked hard questions for 90 minutes straight, and he answered every single one of them without flinching. 3 weeks later, they offered him a seed investment of $1.2 million. Daniel called Marcus from the parking garage of his apartment building the night the term sheet arrived. And Marcus could hear in his voice something he had never heard before. Not excitement exactly, but something underneath excitement. Something quieter and deeper. Like a man who has been running towards something for a very long time and has finally, after everything, arrived. Marcus drove to Columbus that weekend. They went to the same bar they had been going to since they were in their 20s, ordered the same drinks they always ordered, and sat at the same corner table they had sat at more times than either of them could count. Daniel told him everything. The numbers, the timeline, the investor expectations, the plan for the first 18 months. And then, somewhere around the 3rd drink, he leaned across the table and told Marcus that he needed him. Specifically, personally, him. The company needed a brand. It needed a visual identity that could walk into a room and make people understand immediately what it was, what it stood for, how it was different from everything else competing for the same attention. Daniel said he had looked at what design agencies were charging for that kind of work, and the numbers were significant, but more than the money, it was the trust factor. He needed someone who understood what he was trying to build at the level of the idea, not just the aesthetics. He needed someone who got it from the inside out. He needed Marcus. Marcus listened to all of it carefully. He asked questions. He thought about his existing client commitments and how long the timeline would realistically be. He asked Daniel directly what the compensation arrangement would look like, and Daniel told him they would work something out that was fair. He mentioned a monthly retainer, equity consideration down the line, the usual language of a startup, asking a talented friend to come on board and trust the process. Marcus was cautious. He said he wanted to think about it. Daniel said, "Of course, take your time." But then Daniel said something that Marcus would remember for a long time afterward. He said, "Marcus, I would not ask you if I did not believe this was going to be something worth being part of. I am not asking you to do me a favor. I am asking you to build something with me. There is a difference." Marcus went home that weekend, thought about it for a week, and then called Daniel and said yes. What followed were 2 of the most productive and quietly exhausting years of Marcus's professional life. He threw himself into the work with a totality that surprised even him. He started from scratch, researching Daniel's competitors, studying the landscape of logistics technology branding, understanding the specific emotional register that Daniel's target clients, regional business owners and operations managers, would respond to and trust. He designed the logo through 14 rounds of development before arriving at something that felt inevitable in the way that only the best design does, where you look at it and think it could not possibly have been anything else. He built the full brand system, the color palette, the typography, the visual language for all client-facing materials, with the same exhaustive care. He designed the company website from architecture to final pixel. He created pitch deck templates, sales presentation frameworks, email marketing systems, social media guidelines, everything that a growing company needed to show up consistently and compellingly in front of the people it needed to reach. He turned down 3 other clients during this period because he did not have the bandwidth to serve them properly while doing justice to Daniel's project. He worked evenings and weekends. He answered Daniel's calls at all hours when something came up that needed his input. He was, in every meaningful sense of the word, a full partner in the building of this company's public identity, and the results were visible almost immediately. Daniel's first major client presentations, supported by Marcus's materials, closed at a rate that his investors noted with satisfaction. The brand was working. People were responding to it. The company had a visual and emotional clarity that made it stand out in a crowded market, and that clarity had a single author. The compensation arrangement, however, was less clear. Daniel paid Marcus inconsistently during this period. Some months the retainer arrived on time and in full. Other months it was late, or partial, with explanations about cash flow timing that Marcus accepted because he understood startup finances and because this was Daniel. The equity conversation, which Daniel had raised as a possibility in that bar on the night he laid out the opportunity, never materialized into anything formal. Marcus raised it twice. Both times Daniel said they would get to it, that there were more pressing things to sort out first, that Marcus needed to trust the timeline. Marcus trusted the timeline. He trusted Daniel. That trust, as it would turn out, was the most expensive thing he had ever possessed. It was on a Wednesday morning in October, 14 months into the engagement, that Marcus first noticed something that did not sit right. He was doing routine research into a competitor's brand filing when he stumbled across a database of registered trademarks and, out of professional habit, searched Daniel's company name to confirm their own filing status. What he found stopped him completely. The trademark on the company logo, the logo Marcus had designed, the one that had gone through 14 rounds of development, the one that Marcus had spent weeks of his life refining, had been registered. Not under the company name, not under a shared filing that acknowledged his contribution. It had been registered under Daniel's personal name, as sole creator and owner, with a filing date from 8 months prior. 8 months. The filing had happened 8 months ago, while Marcus was still actively working on the brand, still answering Daniel's calls at all hours, still turning down other clients to give this project everything he had. He sat in front of that screen for a long time without moving. He read the filing 3 times to make sure he was understanding it correctly. He was. He picked up his phone and called Daniel. The call went to voicemail. He sent a text message that was measured and professional, asking Daniel to call him when he had a moment because there was something he needed to discuss. The read receipt appeared almost immediately. Daniel had seen the message. He did not call back, not that day, not the next day. On the 3rd day, Marcus sent a second message, this one more direct, stating specifically that he had seen the trademark filing and needed to understand it. Again, the read receipt appeared. Again, no response. By the 4th day, Marcus had retained an attorney, and on the 5th day, a letter arrived from a law firm he had never heard of, representing Daniel Brooks and stating in formal language that any claim Marcus Allen might believe he had to intellectual property associated with the company brand was entirely without merit, that all creative work had been produced as work for hire under an informal agreement, and that any further direct contact on this matter would be treated as harassment. Marcus read that letter 4 times. He thought about the parking lot of that bar 2 years ago, about Daniel's voice when he said, "I am not asking you to do me a favor. I am asking you to build something with me." He thought about Garfield Street, and the handshake, and his mother's driveway, and 23 years of everything. And then he put the letter down, called his attorney back, and told her they were moving forward. The lawsuit Marcus filed against Daniel contained 3 counts. The first was intellectual property theft, the unauthorized trademark registration of a logo Marcus had created. The second was breach of oral contract. The compensation arrangement they had agreed to verbally had never been honored in full, and the equity conversation had been strung along indefinitely without resolution. The third was unjust enrichment. Daniel's company had grown substantially in value, in no small part because of the brand Marcus had built, and Marcus had not been fairly compensated for his contribution to that growth. The legal filing was detailed, documented, and devastating in its specificity, because Marcus had kept records of everything: every email, every text exchange, every invoice, every design file with its creation timestamps intact. He had not kept these records in anticipation of a lawsuit. He had kept them because he was a professional, and that was what professionals did. It turned out that those records were worth more than anything Daniel had ever paid him. The story broke in the local Columbus business press first. A reporter covering the startup and tech scene picked it up from court filings and published a piece under the headline, "Two Childhood Friends Face Off in Court Over Startup Brand Identity Dispute." It was a careful, balanced article that presented both sides without editorializing. Within 48 hours, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets and had found its way onto social media, where it was considerably less balanced. The comments split sharply along 2 lines. One faction saw Marcus as the obvious victim, a creative professional who had been exploited by a wealthy friend and then discarded when his usefulness had run out. The other faction read it entirely differently, a startup founder who had built a company from nothing using his own capital and risk, now being pursued by a disgruntled contractor who had taken on freelance work and was now trying to claim ownership of something he had been hired to produce. Both readings were partial. Neither was complete, but partial readings, delivered with enough conviction on social media, have a way of becoming the dominant narrative before anyone has a chance to correct them. Daniel's legal team was composed of 4 attorneys from a firm that specialized in intellectual property and startup litigation. They were experienced, well-resourced, and strategic, and their initial approach to the case was aggressive. They filed a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the work had been produced as work for hire and that no formal ownership agreement had ever been established. When that motion was denied, they moved to the discovery phase with the apparent intention of overwhelming Marcus's side with document requests, while simultaneously working to undermine his credibility as a witness. They produced communications from Marcus, emails that appeared to show him describing his design contributions as a gift to the company, characterizing his work as something he was doing out of friendship rather than professional obligation, waiving any expectation of ownership. The emails, if authentic, would have significantly complicated Marcus's case. His attorneys looked at them carefully and told him to tell them honestly whether he had sent them. Marcus said no, not in those words, not with that meaning. He had sent emails referencing his friendship with Daniel, certainly. He had sent emails that were warm in tone, casual, informal, as you would expect between lifelong friends conducting business. But he had never described his work as a gift. He had never waived ownership. Something was wrong with those documents. His legal team requested a forensic analysis of the email's metadata, the digital fingerprints embedded in every electronic document that record when it was created, when it was modified, and by whom. The analysis came back 3 weeks later. The emails were real in the sense that they had originated from Marcus's address, but their content had been altered after the fact. Timestamps had been manipulated. Specific phrases had been changed. Words and sentences inserted or modified to shift the meaning from professional communication to casual gift-giving language. Someone had accessed the email records and edited them deliberately, carefully enough to fool a casual reading, but not carefully enough to survive a forensic examination. The question was, who had done it, and when? And the answer, when it emerged, was the last thing anyone in that courtroom had expected. The forensic investigators traced the alterations to an administrator-level login within Daniel's company server. The login belonged to a woman named Karen Mitchell, who had joined the company as an office manager 11 months before the lawsuit was filed. Karen was 32 years old, had no legal background or training, and had, by all accounts, been a loyal and hardworking employee who had developed a fierce personal dedication to Daniel and to the company's success. She had, on her own initiative and without telling anyone, accessed the communication records, identified emails between Marcus and Daniel that she believed could be used to undermine Marcus's case, and modified their content to make them appear more favorable to Daniel's position. She had not been instructed to do this. Daniel had not known she had done it. She had decided, entirely on her own, that protecting the company required it, and she had been wrong in a way that was about to become legally catastrophic. When Daniel's attorneys were presented with the forensic findings, they requested an emergency recess. What happened in the conference room during that recess, the people who were present have never fully described publicly. What is known is that when the session resumed, Daniel's lead attorney made a statement to the court that effectively conceded the evidence tampering finding and requested a continuance. Karen Mitchell was placed on immediate leave and subsequently faced criminal charges for evidence tampering and obstruction. Daniel's legal team, their strategy compromised and their client's position dramatically weakened, began restructuring their approach entirely. And Daniel himself, sitting in that courtroom and hearing the forensic findings read aloud, showed something on his face that the court reporter would later describe to a journalist as looking like a man who had just realized that the fire he thought he was watching from a safe distance had been burning under his own feet the whole time. Within a week of the forensic finding becoming part of the public record, 3 of Daniel's investors requested calls. 2 of them were asking questions. 1 of them was asking for answers. The company's profile, which had been growing steadily since the first round of funding, contracted sharply. 2 corporate clients, who had been in late-stage contract negotiations, put those conversations on hold, pending the resolution of the lawsuit. A partnership discussion with a regional distribution company that Daniel had been working toward for 7 months went quiet. The business did not collapse. Daniel had built something real enough that it could withstand pressure, but the pressure was significant, and it was showing. Meanwhile, something else was happening on Marcus's side of the story that was not part of the public record. He was exhausted. Not just physically, though that was true. The lawsuit had consumed enormous amounts of his time and energy, and had effectively halted his professional life for months. He was exhausted in a deeper way, the way you get exhausted when you have been carrying a grief that you do not quite have the language for, because what Marcus was grieving was not just the stolen logo, or the unpaid invoices, or the 2 years of work that had been leveraged and then dismissed. He was grieving Daniel. He was grieving the version of Daniel who used to call him from a parking garage at midnight, overwhelmed with disbelief that his dream was finally happening. He was grieving the boy on Garfield Street. And that grief was harder to litigate than intellectual property. The case went to mediation 8 months after the initial filing. Both sides came to the table with their positions clearly defined, but their willingness to continue fighting visibly diminished. The mediation lasted 2 full days. On the evening of the second day, an agreement was reached. Marcus received a financial settlement that his attorneys described as substantial, covering the unpaid compensation, a valuation of his intellectual property contribution to the company, and additional damages. He received full public credit as the creator of the company's brand identity, to be documented in all official company materials going forward. He received a co-creator designation that would appear on the brand's founding documentation. He did not receive equity, which had always been the more speculative element of what Daniel had implied, but never committed to in writing. Daniel retained full ownership of the company and continued as its chief executive. Karen Mitchell's criminal matter proceeded separately from the civil settlement. The civil case between Marcus and Daniel was closed. Marcus walked out of the mediation building on the evening of the second day and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment in the cold air before getting into his car. He did not look triumphant. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who had won something important and was trying to figure out whether winning it had been worth what it cost. People who knew him well said that in the weeks that followed, he was quieter than usual, not depressed, not angry, just processing something that did not have a clean resolution, the way most real things in life do not. 6 weeks after the settlement, Marcus used a portion of the financial award to establish his own design agency. He rented a small studio space in a neighborhood he liked, set up his equipment, and began rebuilding his client roster from the ground up. He was careful this time in ways he had not been before. Every engagement documented in writing, every scope of work defined with precision, every intellectual property arrangement made explicit before a single hour of work began. He brought in 2 junior designers within the first year. The agency grew modestly and well, in keeping with the character of the man who built it. He signed contracts. He trusted processes. He trusted people carefully, in proportion to what they had shown him, rather than what they promised. Daniel's company stabilized. The investors who had pulled back returned their attention once the legal matter was resolved and the forensic scandal had faded from the news cycle. The partnership discussions that had gone quiet resumed, and 2 of them closed successfully in the following year. The company was smaller than Daniel had envisioned at this point in his timeline, but it was still standing, still operating, still relevant in its market. Daniel himself was quieter than he had been before all of this, less loud in rooms, less hungry for the center of attention, as if the weight of what had happened had compressed something in him that had previously been all upward pressure and outward expansion. People who worked with him noted it. A few of them preferred it. It was Daniel who made the first move. 6 months after the settlement, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, he called Marcus's number. Marcus saw the name on his screen and let it ring. He let the second call ring too. On the third call, he answered. He did not say hello warmly. He did not say anything at first. He just held the phone and waited. Daniel said, "I know you do not have any reason to talk to me. I am not calling to argue or explain or justify anything. I just want to ask if we can meet. Not to do business, not to negotiate anything, just to sit across from each other the way we used to, and talk like human beings." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I will think about it." He called Daniel back 3 days later and said yes. They met at a diner in Columbus, not the bar where they had sat on the night Daniel received his term sheet, but a quieter place, a booth by a window. They both arrived within 2 minutes of each other, which felt like the kind of coincidence that is not really a coincidence. They sat down. There were no lawyers. There were no phones on the table. There was coffee, and there was the strange suspended feeling of being alone with someone you have loved and lost and are not sure how to categorize anymore. What was said in that booth over the next 2 hours has never been shared publicly by either of them in detail. Marcus spoke about it once, briefly, in a podcast interview the following year, and he said this: "I did not go there to forgive him. I did not go there expecting anything in particular. I went because I needed to understand. Not what he did. I already understood what he did. I needed to understand who he became and how he got there. And when I sat across from him and listened to him talk, I think I did understand it. He got lost. Money has a way of doing that to people who have spent their whole lives without it. It does not make them evil. It does not erase who they were. But it gets between them and everything they knew about themselves, and some people find their way back through it, and some people do not. I think Daniel is still finding his way back, and that is not my journey to manage. But understanding it made it easier to put down. There is a question that this story keeps returning to, no matter which direction you approach it from. It is not the question of whether what Daniel did was wrong. It clearly was. It is not the question of whether Marcus deserved better. He clearly did. The question is the harder one underneath all of that. What does wealth actually do to a person? Not the superficial version of that question, the easy cynicism about money corrupting people, but the real version. What happens inside a human being when the financial pressure that has defined their entire existence, that has shaped every decision they have ever made, every fear they have ever carried, every dream they have ever had to scale back or abandon, suddenly lifts, when the thing you have been pushing against your whole life is no longer there? Because the answer, it turns out, is not simple. For some people, that moment of financial freedom clarifies who they are. It removes the noise and the distraction and reveals a person who is, underneath it all, exactly who they always believed themselves to be. For others, it does something more complicated. It removes the structure that was holding a certain version of them together. The pressure was not just a burden, it was also a container. And without it, things that had been shaped by it, their sense of obligation, their loyalty, their awareness of what it felt like to have nothing, begin to shift in ways they may not even notice until the damage is already done. Daniel Brooks was not a villain. He was a man who had grown up wanting one thing more than he had ever wanted anything else in his life, and when he finally got it, he did not know how to hold it without losing himself in it. That does not absolve him. It does not undo what Marcus lost, or the years of his life that went into building something that was taken from him without acknowledgement. But it makes the story true in the way that only complicated things are true, not reducible to a simple lesson or a clean moral, but resonant in the way that human failure usually is, which is to say, recognizable. The capacity for what Daniel did lives in more people than would like to admit it. The capacity for what Marcus endured, and ultimately survived with his integrity intact, is rarer than it should be, and more admirable than it usually gets credit for. Marcus Allen built his agency into something he is proud of. He has a staff of 5 people now, a client list that speaks for itself, and a founding philosophy printed on the wall of his studio that reads, "Every agreement in writing, every contribution acknowledged, every person treated as if they matter, because they do." He has spoken at 2 design industry events about the experience of having his work stolen and what it taught him about the importance of protecting your creative output with the same care you give to producing it. He does not speak bitterly about Daniel when he speaks publicly. He speaks factually. He speaks carefully. He speaks like a man who has processed something difficult and arrived on the other side of it with his sense of himself intact. Daniel Brooks continues to run his company, which has grown past its post-scandal contraction and is now tracking toward a second round of funding. He does not speak publicly about Marcus or about the lawsuit. What he has done, according to people who work with him, is build a company culture that is notably more transparent and more rigorously documented than it was in its early days. Every agreement is in writing. Every creative contribution is acknowledged and compensated according to a formal agreement. Every employee and contractor knows exactly where they stand. Whether those changes came from genuine transformation or from the very practical lesson of what happens when you do not operate that way, is a question only Daniel can answer. And the friendship, the thing that started on Garfield Street between 2 12-year-old boys who had nothing except each other, and the unshakable conviction that their lives were going to be something, that friendship is neither fully restored nor fully gone. It exists in the complicated middle space where real things often end up, past the point of being what it was, not quite at the point of being nothing. They have seen each other twice since the diner meeting, brief, careful encounters in which the old warmth is present but changed in quality, like a song you loved that has been covered by someone new. You recognize it, you can appreciate it, but it sounds different now, and you are always aware, in some part of you, of the original. So here is the question this story leaves with you, and I want you to sit with it honestly, rather than answering it quickly. Not the question of whether Daniel was wrong. That question has an easy answer. The harder question is this. If you had been Marcus, and your phone rang a third time with Daniel's name on the screen, would you have answered it? Would you have been able to separate the person from the thing the person did, the way Marcus was ultimately able to do? Or would the loss have been too total, the betrayal too personal, the grief of watching someone you grew up with transform into someone capable of that? Would it have been too much to sit across a table from? There is no right answer. People who would answer yes, and people who would answer no, are both operating from something true about human nature. But I think the reason this story matters, the reason it stays with you, is not the lawsuit or the trademark or the forensic investigators or the courtroom. It is that third phone call. It is the fact that Marcus answered it. That, more than anything else in this entire story, tells you who Marcus Allen is. And it asks you, quietly and directly, who you are. This has been A Friendship Broken by Wealth, here on Echoes of Tales. If this story moved you, if it made you think about a friendship you have had, a trust you have placed, a moment in your own life when money changed the shape of something you thought was permanent, drop it in the comments. We read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it right now, because the next story we are bringing you is even more layered, even more human, and it will leave you with questions you will be turning over for days. We will see you there.